Yes, well, thank you for having me. Yeah, as you said, the report came to the conclusion on the basis of the facts that we have assessed on the ground that the Israeli authorities are committing the crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution, as set out in the ICC Rome Statute, as well as understood by general international law as well. What we have done in our report, it's a very, very thorough legal and factual analysis. In fact, it's over 200 pages long. And it's on the basis of not only the last 2 years of our research, but in fact, Human Rights Watch has been researching on these issues in Israel and Palestine, in fact, for decades. And as the report says, we found that there has been a threshold crossed. And what we mean by that is that the level of discrimination suffered by the Palestinian people and the privileging of and the dominance, ensuring that there's a dominance of the Jewish Israelis over the Palestinians has got to such a level, is so systematically ingrained, in particular in the occupied Palestinian territories, that it fulfills these crimes as set out in the Rome Statute. What essentially apartheid means in the Rome Statute is that discrimination, systemic discrimination, has got to such a high and terrible level that, in fact, it is now a system of apartheid and a crime as set out under international law. So, in terms of what that means, then in our findings, what we had to look at was whether the elements of the crimes were in fact fulfilled. And the elements of the crimes, there are three main elements. The first element is that there is intent. So we need to find, in fact, we found that the Israeli government has an intention to ensure that the Jewish Israeli population dominates over the Palestinian population. And we found that through various laws, policies, and practices. It was evident in the nation-state law. It was evident in policies around the expansion and the establishment of settlements, and the policies around ensuring that the Palestinian people were kept into small enclaves and were not allowed to have any particular territorial contiguity. The second element of the crime was around looking to see whether that intent was given effect to in a system. So was it systemic discrimination and oppression? And we found that in particular in occupied Palestinian territories that it was. And we looked at, for example, the fact that Palestinians and Israeli Jewish people are governed by different law. In fact, the Palestinians are governed by military law, which in a lot of ways can be very repressive, or is very repressive. And the Israeli Jewish people are privileged by being able to live under the civil law of Israel. We looked at the rights to nationality that are given to Palestinians versus Jewish Israelis in East Jerusalem, which are very, very different, and including access to land and land rights, which we can see has arisen in Sheikh Jarrah. And then finally, we looked at the inhumane acts which are coupled with that. And when we put all of that together, we found that the crimes are and have been committed by Israel and Israeli authorities. We have been documenting discrimination that has been suffered by Palestinian people. And before I go on about that, I think it's really important to note that Human Rights Watch has not and has never only looked at one particular group in any context, when in fact there are human rights violations going on by a number of different parties. So in the context of Israel-Palestine, we've also done human rights reports and looked at abuses that are being committed by Hamas and the Palestinian authorities. In fact, in 2018, we came out with a 150-page report about the abuses that were committed by Hamas and the Palestinian authorities against Palestinians, as well as on numerous occasions looking at the indiscriminate use of force by Hamas as well. But in relation to this discrimination that we're talking about, Human Rights Watch has on past occasions, identified in isolated incidents or in isolated vicinities the kinds of discrimination that we're talking about. And what we found, in fact, that it wasn't isolated and in relation to only a particular incident or a particular area. After many years of documenting this, we found that, in fact, when you put it all together, what you see is a system of repression and discrimination that reached such a high threshold. So that's one of the reasons we ended up publishing this report now, is on the basis of our ongoing research on this issue. The second reason as to why now, and the report is called A Threshold Crossed. And what that means is there's a few reasons that we say that the threshold has been crossed in relation to these crimes. The first one is that for a long time, the idea that the situation is actually in fact temporary and is going to be resolved by the peace process means that we haven't been looking at the reality on the ground, and we have disconnected the peace process from, in fact, what's happening. And we've said, well, that doesn't matter because it will all be solved. And what we have said in our report is, in fact, what we have seen on the ground is not only is there a stagnation, a status quo, but in fact, the situation is getting worse and worse. So more and more settlements are being built. More and more discrimination is being inflicted on Palestinian people. Systems are becoming more embedded. So we're saying now in this report that this is not a temporary situation anymore. This is in fact permanent and a regressing, and the world needs to address the human rights of Palestinians. It means a number of different things. It means the system means that if I am a Palestinian and I am living in the West Bank and I am living a number of meters away from a settlement, it means that the law that is applied to me is very, very different than the law that is applied to the person who is a number of meters away from me. It means that I am subject to military law, which on a number of different levels is very, very repressive and inconsistent with international human rights. It means that that person who lives, that Israeli Jewish person who lives a number of meters away from me, is entitled to all the protections of Israeli law, civil protections, political protections, so on and so forth. So we lead very different lives in terms of the kinds of rights and protections that we enjoy. It also means that all the Palestinians that are living under occupation in the West Bank, in Gaza, in East Jerusalem, they have been wholly denied their civil rights. Their civil rights have been wholly suppressed. It means that if I'm a Palestinian living in East Jerusalem, my residency rights are not guaranteed. If I'm an Israeli Jewish person living there, my residency rights are 100% guaranteed. It means that if I'm living in Gaza and I'm a Palestinian, I am blocked from leaving other than in very, very exceptional humanitarian circumstances. It means that I am not only unable to leave, it means that if I have cancer, I'm probably, well, there's a very high chance that I won't be able to go and get treatment for that cancer. Or if I have complications, other health complications, it means that I have no access to electricity, that a number of my different rights in terms of my access to health, education, so on and so forth are significantly deprived. So along the line in respect of a number of different rights, I as a Palestinian have very, very different rights and a very, very different life to my counterpart who is a Jewish citizen. Certainly, and that's the point, in fact. And I think we came out with our report, obviously had no idea that the incidents in Sheikh Jarrah were going to, the violence and the inflicted on the Palestinian people in terms of evictions, and then the what we could see potentially excessive use of force used against the Palestinian people who were protesting restrictions to Al-Aqsa Mosque. We had no idea that this was going to erupt, but it did. And I think it really, and then obviously the violence that happened in Gaza and in Israel. But what it did do very clearly for us, it meant very, very clearly that whilst people talk about the escalation of violence and then the cessation of violence and the reversion to the status quo, that status quo is in fact what is fueling the conflict, because peace can never be arrived at without fundamental rights. Whilst people are suffocated of their rights, whilst there is embedded discrimination on every level of their life, civil rights, land rights, access to education, access to medical care, whilst you are starved of those rights on an everyday basis, you are never going to have stability. And so for us, it's about recognizing as Human Rights Watch and really calling on the international community to recognize that these root causes of the issue and of the violence needs to be addressed, because otherwise eruptions will continue to happen. And importantly, millions of Palestinians will live without these rights. So essentially, there are different situations that arise in respect of the land, for example, in East Jerusalem and in the West Bank. So what we know, first of all, I think it should be really clear, is that millions of dunams of land, I think it is 2 million dunams of land, have been expropriated from the Palestinians. So essentially stolen from the Palestinians by Israel. So what we know is that a number of Palestinians, particularly like we've seen in East Jerusalem, where the Israeli government have claimed that they have annexed that land, but in fact it continues to be occupied, is occupied Palestinian territory, is that in respect to the land there, they have sought to forcibly evict Palestinians from that land. Now, this is very problematic on a number of levels, obviously. The first one is that an occupying power is prohibited from depriving the population of their land, from transferring land, from taking land, and from transferring their population into that land. But regardless of that, and also prohibited from imposing their own laws. But we've seen, particularly in East Jerusalem and in relation to Sheikh Jarrah, this is exactly what Israel has done. They've essentially said, we are going to impose Israeli law, which says that, and it was in 1970 Israeli law that said that if property was held by Jewish people in 1948, that Jewish people can reclaim that land. But it's not necessarily being reclaimed by the person who held the key. It's being reclaimed by collectives of people who are supposedly representing the person whose land it was. But on the other side, you have Palestinians who were dispossessed of their land and homes, who in 1948 were classified as absentees. So it's, again, that discrimination. But in relation to East Jerusalem, what will usually happen, you can see that there's severe intimidation and violence that often occurs where people are where they try to evict people, private people try to evict people, and often it's called a private property dispute, which it obviously is not. But we obviously also see it being taken through the courts. So usually the way that it will be done is that this particular collective, or whatever in particular, however it characterizes itself, will go to court and will seek title over that land. And because the law that's being applied is Israeli law, which privileges Israeli Jewish people, it means that as it's gone through most of all of the processes, particularly we've seen in East Jerusalem, particularly in relation to Sheikh Jarrah, the courts have consistently found in favor of the Jewish-Israeli associations. And eventually, at the moment, they have suspended the judgment because of the conflict that was and the violence. But what we eventually can assume is that a judgment will essentially mean that those people will be the Palestinians who are living there since 1967 will be forcibly evicted from their properties. And in the interim, until the court order is given, what those people suffer is constant harassment, constant intimidation. And what we've seen is that the Israeli government has done nothing. In fact, not just done nothing, they've incited and instigated and promoted that violence from continuing to happen. And it's important to note that the deprivation and of the dislocation of Palestinians from their land continues in this form, in the sense that this is now institutionalized and legalized in the Israeli system, albeit unlawful under international law, and that those people who are dislocated have nowhere else to go. So I think, essentially that's the processes. Yes, well, in our report, we say that they're in violation of international criminal law. And very relevant to that is the fact that the International Criminal Court has an investigation which is currently open in relation to particular the activities in the occupied Palestinian territories. So that's in relation to both what the Israeli government and authorities are doing, as well as the non-state groups, Hamas and the PLO. So that is an ongoing investigation, and we are encouraging the ICC to include the crime of apartheid and persecution into their investigation. And that's obviously very, very important in terms of accountability. What we've found in respect of Israel is that they have consistently been able to operate with impunity because there has been no justice. And what we are saying now is this is a really important moment with respect to the ICC. Unfortunately, we have states which are very significant in terms of their influence, such as the UK and the US, who've come out with the US is obviously has a larger policy against the ICC, but in particular in the UK, coming out and saying that they are that they don't agree with the ICC investigating this issue because Israel is a friend and ally. So that's one aspect, but we're also calling for governments to be doing more. And so we're saying to governments they should be exercising their own criminal laws and jurisdiction if an Israeli official who is implicated somehow, either directly or indirectly in a crime, that they should be trying them on their territory, that they should be ensuring that their military, security and diplomatic cooperation does not in any way contribute or facilitate these crimes, and that in fact, even in the instances where they don't directly, they should be ensuring that they are saying to the Israelis that we're going to temper our cooperation on the basis that you make progress in relation to these crimes. So there are a number of things that we're saying. We're also asking and we're pushing, and now what we've seen, which is very encouraging, is a special session has just been announced at the Human Rights Council in Geneva on the situation. And there we understand that there is negotiations around the text of that, and the text looks like it will be, which is one of our recommendations, calling for a commission of inquiry. And that's one of the things that we've been calling for. The international community, and in particular the Human Rights Council, needs to establish a commission of inquiry to be looking at this systemic discrimination. So there are a number of different levels that we say states, international institutions should be acting to ensure that there is accountability and that there is no longer impunity. Disappointingly, I would say, is the word. They have not responded with the force that we would have hoped in terms of calling Israel to account, and obviously at the same time calling Hamas to account for its crimes. But what we haven't seen is states, particularly the states that have influence and power in relation to Israel, have not been outspoken on this issue. But I would say, and I mean, what we've seen along those lines is the US government had for many, many days blocked even a statement coming out of the Security Council. And whilst they did permit a statement to come out, it was a very, very weak statement that did not call out Israel for the violations that it committed and or even allegedly committed. So it's been disappointing, but I think there are what we have seen at Human Rights Watch is, whilst there's been states that haven't come out with as strong as we want, we are seeing a shift. We are seeing a shift in the way that people view the issue and respond to the issue. For a long time, we've relied on, and states have relied on, this paradigm of a peace process. And I think what we're seeing now is a recognition by states that it is no longer just about a peace process, but it is necessary to deal with the discrimination and repression, which is really partly the thing that we're seeing at the Human Rights Council, which many will object to. But we're starting to see things that we've never seen before, where the international community, states are forcing one another to actually look at the underlying issues. So I would say, also the French foreign minister came out recently and he said that if things do not change on the ground, and obviously I'm paraphrasing, this could lead to a system of apartheid. And so we're starting to see a recognition of these crimes in a way that we would never have before. So I think whilst it has been disappointing on the whole, the shift is happening. And that shift is happening from states and the ICC. And we are very much hoping that Israel is going to very clearly get the message that it cannot continue to operate a system of severe repression and discrimination against half the people that are living under its control.